India's union budget will be presented tomorrow, and for India Today Global, here we will be focusing on what it means for the Ministry of External Affairs and India's global ambitions. When the union budget is presented each year, discussions typically revolve around taxation, infrastructure, and defense. Yet, there is one area that escapes public scrutiny. It is the budget allocation for India's Ministry of External Affairs. As India aspires to be a global leader, its diplomatic ambitions require robust financial backing. But with the MEA receiving just 0.4% of total government expenditure, can India truly achieve its foreign policy goals? Can it become a global leader? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. Despite an unprecedented 23% increase in the MEA budget last year, the ministry remains one of the least funded government departments. Between 2017 and the year 2023, MEA saw only a modest 4% annual budget hike. Yet, it has maintained an efficient utilization rate surpassing 96% of its revised estimates. Now, this begs the question: why does India's foreign policy apparatus continue to operate on such limited financial resources? And it is not just the expansion of the budget in terms of finance, it is also about people and the strength of the Ministry of External Affairs, which further would require more budget to ensure that there's more hiring of IFS officers. There are partner countries who expect greater engagement with India when it comes to execution of projects and implementation of development project and work, which will require a lot of money. The current MEA budget, just 0.4% of the total expenditure, falls far short of what is needed. Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs had suggested raising this allocation to at least 1% of the total budget, which would mean a 63% hike for the MEA budget. While such a drastic rise seems unlikely, even a gradual increase to 0.6% or 0.8% would signal a stronger commitment to India's foreign policy objectives. To discuss India's global ambitions and the funding that is provided to Ministry of External Affairs, whether that can really further India's foreign policy objectives, I'm being joined by Constantino Xavier. He is Senior Fellow with CSEP, which is Center for Social and Economic Progress. Constantino, thank you so much for joining us. You've written an article with Riya Sinha. It focuses on the budget, and there are comparisons that have been made with regards to the budget allocations in the past. Then the 2017 to 2023 period. Last year saw an increase. But what does all this mean for Ministry of External Affairs, for India's foreign policy? And what are your expectations from the coming budget?
So overall, it's good news, Geeta. I think after many years of stagnation, growth in the 3%, 4% figures, sometimes even a decrease in the MEA budget. Last year, we saw a growth in 23% year on year. And this year, I expect another growth, maybe not as hard. But it's important to underline, as you mentioned, utilization, importance, that every rupee counts in the MEA budget to accelerate India's interests in the region and beyond. And therefore, we see, I think, a general increase in the MEA budget. Of course, then there's a question of what do you do with each rupee? Where do you put in your buck to get the greatest bang, the greatest impact for India's interests beyond India?
Okay, we will talk about what should India's priorities be. The larger picture over here also is that when we're talking about MEA budget allocations, there are specific areas that MEA deals with, but in the larger perspective of strategic budget allocations, defense also does come in, and therefore the strategic budget allocation is far greater, and the percentage is far higher. But specifically sticking to foreign policy. Now, India has had major foreign policy ambitions, global ambitions, Constantino. Do you think the budget commensurates with the ambitions?
I think the short answer is no. The budget needs to increase systematically, structurally to much higher levels. But also before you increase it, you have to be very clear about what you need it for and where. So sometimes I think more than just an ask, it is important to think also for what. In fact, one of the reasons why often the Ministry of Finance has been reluctant to allocate greater budgetary resources to the Ministry of External Affairs is that there's not really, I think, an appreciation in other ministries of the work the MEA does. You mentioned a word strategic. I think the traditional idea of diplomacy is you have to run a few embassies, you have to do some consular support for the growing Indian diaspora, but really that strategic issues are security, defense, acquisitions, etc. I'd actually argue the MEA plays an extremely strategic role in helping Indian companies going abroad, in accessing foreign direct investment into India. For example, just to give you one example, 10 to 15% of the MEA budget has been going into Bhutan alone. And many people ask themselves, why? Why would you be, sending 4,000 crores every year of rupees into Bhutan? The reason is very simple. In fact, the success is already showing. Today, Bhutan is developing its hydropower to an extent never seen before. It is exporting a lot of it at very favorable prices to India. And in fact, it's thinking about connecting its grid to Bangladesh, which again has a strategic interest because by delivering this to these countries, you are tying them to India, you're connecting them, developing interdependence. Frankly, you're making India out campaigns or anti-India sentiments much more costly and difficult for these countries.
That's a very interesting point, but we do know that Bhutan is a traditional historical partner until the royal family supports and stands with India. There isn't going to be much of a change in Bhutan's foreign policy, but that is also shifting. And Constantino, China is a major factor here in the region as also globally. Now, let's just talk about prioritizing what India should be doing in various parts of the world, particularly in the region. Now, we do want to be global players. India does want to be a global player, but is a very important key player in the region itself. How much of India's focus on various budgetary allocations when it comes to aid, development work, all of that should be focused on certain countries in the region, keeping China in mind?
I mean, Bhutan, you mentioned, has been a tradition, but Bhutan is becoming increasingly important. The Chinese
Yes.
are trying to develop relations with Bhutan. They are dying to open up diplomatic relations with Bhutan. So there will be a day, whenever it comes, where China will intensify and formalize its relations with Bhutan. And that is the importance of diplomacy and of what you called strategic again. It is looking out to the future and preparing India's ground today so that wherever China comes in, you are already prepared. You have your stakes on the ground, you have investment happening, you have trade happening. And that's where diplomacy comes in. So if you look at Africa, for example, there are, of course, huge advantage to what the Chinese have been doing in Africa. But there's a window of opportunity today because after years of the Chinese flooding these developing countries in the global south with aid, grants, that came tied sometimes with conditions or was not even absorbable by these countries because it came into difficulties where the Chinese tried to shape governance or frankly didn't cough up the money they promised in the first place. Now there's a window for India to come in and develop sustainable long-term development projects that again are not based on grants, which basically is free money for these countries, but on lines of credit. In fact, we see in our budget analysis a progressive shift in the MEA from grants, which are gifts
To
basically to other
LOCs.
countries, to
Yeah.
lines of credit which come tied to procurement from India. So that helps Indian companies export. And that again creates jobs in India. And as we see in the global south, huge economies of scale in Africa, again, for example, and the Chinese struggling in some ways or trying to change gears. This is a moment where India can really step up, and it will need, including in the MEA, budget to do this.
Well, the economic review is also out, and in that they are saying that instability in the globally is going to certainly affect and impact India, and the growth rate might not be as positive as it has been in the past, but yet they still show is seeing some growth. On that account, if we talk about how India is viewing a few things and how that could impact India because of the decisions being taken by Trump and the United States of America. Let's begin with BRICS. A massive threat by Donald Trump on BRICS, saying that if they continue, there's going to be a 100% tariff. How is this tariff war going to impact India and the Indian economy?
I mean, it's very difficult to guess as anything
The
relating
whole,
to the
the whole
US and Trump
idea,
these
the whole
days.
yeah, can I just the whole idea about BRICS is the fact that Trump fears that every local currency transaction that BRICS is planning on having their own currency, a BRICS currency, is or will lead to de-dollarization of the global economy,
Yes, and India has taken steps in that regard. That's undeniable. India is allowing now rupee trade with some of its neighbors. It enforced some of these agreements over the last
including
few
Russia.
years with Russia. But I think there the concern is also an opportunity because trade with the US is, of course, critical for India's exports. But I think what we've seen over the last years, in fact, what was driving something we just discussed, which is the focus on the global south, on Africa, on the
Hmm.
neighborhood, and on these large economies where middle classes are growing. These are alternative markets for India to trade with. So while you will come under stress with Trump today, with a more protectionist Europe tomorrow, with other global north economies that are demographically in decline, frankly, it is critical for India to develop access to new consumer markets. Africa and the global south, which is again why we saw so much emphasis on the global south under the G20, but also, frankly, next door Bangladesh. India exported up to $15 billion worth. In fact, India-Bangladesh trade relations were, before the Ukraine war, 3 times more than what India traded with Russia. So, an
Yes.
eighth largest country next door, Bangladesh, is in that sense increasingly important for India to find alternative trade markets for exports, but also for imports and supply chains with Southeast Asia. And there again, the political stability in these countries is very important, where you're going to need diplomatic resources to play a role in stabilizing these countries. That's very difficult, but nothing will happen in Bangladesh in the future that will lead to political stability unless India supports that and works with Bangladesh. And for that, again, you need more resources on the ground to play an important role through India's missions, for example. And let me just finish on that, something I've repeated many times, Geeta. I mean, if you don't have the people to perform diplomacy, to pursue India's interests on the ground, it's very difficult to identify opportunities and threats. And at less than 1,000 Indian Foreign Service offices today operating at headquarters in Delhi, across Indian states, connecting Indian central interests with state interests, and in 200 missions worldwide, 1,000 people will just not be able to perform that humongous task and very important ambition for the country around the world.
Again, a very, very important point. 1,000 IFS officers, and you're saying they are not enough, and that the Indian government will have to think of expanding the MEA, not just the budget, but also personnel.
And that's why you need budget for. It is critical. This is absolutely critical, Gita. I think these are heroes, the IFS officers. They're absolute heroes in service of India's ambitious foreign policy. I think there's a formidable vision for the country. There's a difficult context, but to reach that, to navigate that and reach the ambition of 2047 Viksit Bharat, a developed country, to navigate a tough neighborhood, which we just discussed, to navigate and engage an unpredictable, erratic president, which is your major partner worldwide in the United States, you will need a strong, strong human resource system that is made of people, that is made of people that are trade specialists, that are specialists in technology, that are specialists in health diplomacy, that are able to identify risks and opportunities in the digital domain, that speak a variety of languages to be on the ground and build political alliance with different groups. Um, India needs to invest massively in that system. And for that, you need a huge budget upgrade into capacity building, training, and certainly an IFS system that is not taking 30 to 40 people every year, but also performs lateral entry possibilities for people from the private sector, academia, and think tanks to support the system, works directly with a variety of constituencies that are interested and, frankly, at risk today because most of India's growth today hinges on a benign regional and global environment. And to navigate it, you need that expertise.
Constantine Xavier, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. But this is just part of the interview with him. If you want to watch the full interview, please continue to be logged on to India Today Global's YouTube channel and go into the interview section where the full interview is available. India's global aspirations demand a well-funded foreign policy apparatus. While the government has made significant diplomatic strides, its commitment is not fully reflected in MEA's budget. Also, budget expansion does not only confine itself to the financial expansion aspect. Like Constantino Xavier said, there has to be expansion of personnel as well. A more robust allocation would not only enhance India's credibility on the global stage, but also ensure that its foreign policy goals are met with sustained impact. As India looks to strengthen its global presence, the question remains, can the country afford to underfund its diplomacy while aiming for global leadership? Thank you for watching Statecraft.